Hello and welcome to a Wheels Boy quick review. The theme for today's video is second chances. The first car that we drove from Aion, the all-electric sub-brand of GAC here in China, left us feeling, well, a little bit lukewarm. Today, however, we're going to give them another try with this, the Aion S all-electric sedan. Will it leave a better impression than the Aion LX that we drove previously on the channel? There's only one way to find out, so let's get started. Of all the complaints I had about the Aion LX, design wasn't one of them. I found that to be a very attractive SUV, and the same is true for this sedan. I especially like the design of the headlights here, which keep some of the, raindrop look of the Aion LX without being quite so dramatic. I also want to take the moment to point out this here. This is the camera as part of the ADI-Go or ADI-Go self-driving system, something we'll talk a little bit more about when we drive the car. And then finally, I want to point out down here, this grille area. Now, it looks like it would just be plastic, but this thing, once you unlock the car, does open up. I assume for aerodynamic reasons, as well as to get rid of some heat from the front-mounted electric motor. The side profile of the Aion S reminds me quite a bit of that of the Xpeng P5 that we recently drove on the channel, in the sense that it has a big slab of a door and a relatively small greenhouse that flows into a somewhat coupe-like roofline. This one is even more of a three-box design versus the Xpeng P5. The other thing I want to point out is here, the wheels, while a very attractive design, very simple, they're not quite as cool as the ones that were on the Aion LX. Ones I described as having like a robot flower. Can't help but miss that. Here on the rear end, we have a nice taillight design with a Lexus-esque point here, something I see in a lot of cars these days. And then one small detail that I enjoy is right here, there is a nice piece of body color material that separates the rear taillights, something that looks very nice, especially in this pink color on the car. Moving on to everyone's favorite part of the video, some luscious trunk shots. But first, I must start with a complaint. This car does not have a physical button for opening the rear trunk. You have two methods. You can either use the button inside, or the driver's side of the door. I believe you can get the button. You get close, it will open. Or you use the fob. Put simply, I don't like that. I would much prefer to have a physical button. Once you do get it open, however, you see there's about 453 liters of space, quite a capacious rear trunk in terms of both depth and depth inward as well. Let's take a seat inside and see what we've got. Well, I've noticed some similarities between this and the LX, but also some major differences. Let's start with the similarities. There is the same peninsula-esque floating center console here, a design that I think looks good, but I'm not entirely sure is very practical, though there is some space here below as well as here in the center console. There are much more differences, however, and the biggest one starts here at the screens. The Aion LX that we drove had two 12.3-inch screens, one for the instrument cluster and one here for your center screen that were kind of connected like so. These are much more separate. Here is a 12.3-inch, and here is a much larger 14.6-inch screen. I would also comment that the UI has undergone some changes which make it, in my opinion, much better to use, though it may be that I learned it on the Aion LX, so it feels a little easier now. You all know I'm a big fan of colors inside of cars, so I have to admit that I'm not super delighted with the specific colors inside of this car. I love the exterior. The interior doesn't really do much for me. There's a gray color pattern here, as well as the black here on the dashboard and the doors, and then a darker gray here. Tones of gray, not what I would consider splashes of color, not very great. Here on the center console, one other difference between this and the LX I want to point out, and one that I do think is an improvement, is the transmission knob here. The LX had the P button, or the park button, here between the drive modes and the knob, which I found kind of inefficient, whereas here they now have the P right here in the middle, much easier to access, much better. When it comes to the back seat, the first thing I notice is this car is slightly behind the Xpeng P5 in terms of space. Here in legroom, but especially in headroom. Not particularly impressed with the amount of headroom back here. Speaking of headroom, or what's above your head at least, there is a very nice glass roof. Looks great, very nice on a relatively cloudy day, but I have to admit on this sunny day, it gets pretty hot under this thing. Other things to note, continuation of the shades of gray and silver and black interior, still not a fan. Here in the center we have 2 USB ports and a fold-down armrest. A final note, in terms of interior material quality, I would say this is just about in line with the P5. Not bad. All versions of the Aion S come equipped with a single front-mounted electric motor, but there are a variety of battery packs and power levels available, which I'm going to read to you now. The entry-level version has a 50.6 kilowatt-hour lithium iron phosphate battery providing an NEDC range of 410 kilometers, 100 kilowatts of power, and 225 newton meters of torque. Next up, we have a 58.8 kilowatt-hour lithium-ion battery pack providing 510 kilometers of NEDC range, 150 kilowatts, and 350 newton meters of torque. Then we have the third option. The range-topping car that we're driving today has a 69.9 nice kilowatt-hour battery pack providing 602 kilometers of NEDC range, 165 kilowatts, and 350 newton meters of torque. That's about 225 horsepower and 260 pound-feet. The official 0 to 100 kilometer per hour time is 6.8 seconds, and it's quick. It really does feel quite quick. Very much adequate for daily use, no doubt about that. The brakes, on the other hand, I don't like very much. They're just a little bit too touchy for my taste. I understand it takes time to get used to them, but I've driven this car quite a bit, and I still find myself braking a little bit harder than I want to. Speaking of brakes, however, there is a one-pedal system they call iPedal that has a nice button down here to the left of the steering wheel you can easily use to turn it on and off. I like one-pedal driving in my electric cars, and this is a good system with one small caveat, which is that it tends to cruise once it gets to a low speed as opposed to bringing the car fully to a stop like the Tesla system does, for example, and I prefer that. I prefer the car stop completely when I'm using one pedal. The driving dynamics of the Aion S definitely lean farther towards the comfort end of the spectrum, farther than the P5, for example, which has a little bit more of an athletic feel to its chassis. Steering as well, nicely weighted, but not very much feedback. Still, it's quite comfortable, as I mentioned. The NVH is quite low, and the seats are very comfortable. I would be happy to spend a good amount of time in this car, perhaps during a long commute or something like that. Now, that does mean that the actual handling of the car, not particularly great. There's a lot of wallow when you're going around corners because, hey, it's a heavy electric sedan, and it's definitely not a sports sedan. I mentioned while discussing the front-end design of the Aion S that it had a autonomous or semi-autonomous rather driving system, and it does. It is the same one that you find in the Aion LX that we drove, and it is also one of my biggest complaints about this car, just as it was with the LX. It's simply not a good system. It doesn't do a good job of keeping you within the lane, ping-ponging from left to right, and it also doesn't do a good job of sensing the vehicle in front of you in time to apply the brakes. It feels, every time I come up behind a car, like it waits to the last second to throw on the brakes, and it makes me very uncomfortable and doesn't make me want to use it particularly. This, I think, is one of the biggest reasons this car is a little bit cheaper than the Xpeng P5. This car's prices range from about $22,000 to about $26,000 or $27,000 US dollars, whereas the P5 can top at over $30,000. The biggest difference is that type of technology. The P5 is simply a more advanced vehicle. So there you have it. While our first experience of Aion, the LX, left us feeling a little bit lukewarm, this one, the Aion S, was much more positive and makes me look forward to trying out their other car, the Aion Y. That's going to do it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching again, and as always, check us out on Facebook and Instagram. Links in the description below. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell.
Thank you for watching. See you again soon.